The beach had always been a place where Ethan could hear his own thoughts, but this time, the sound of the waves only made them louder. He stood barefoot in the sand, watching the horizon blur into shades of blue and gray, wondering why a simple weekend trip with his closest friend felt heavier than it should. Lucas had suggested the getaway casually, as if it were nothing more than an escape from routine. "We both need air," he'd said over the phone, his voice easy, familiar. Ethan agreed without hesitation. He trusted Lucas more than anyone, more, he sometimes admitted in private, than he trusted himself. They had met years ago through mutual friends, bonded by long conversations and shared silences. Lucas was the kind of person who listened without interrupting, who remembered small details and asked the questions others avoided. Ethan, quieter by nature, found comfort in that attention. Over time, their friendship became the place Ethan went when life felt misaligned. At home, things with Mark were steady. That was the word Ethan used when friends asked. Steady sounded responsible, adult, safe. Mark was kind and dependable, but lately their conversations felt transactional, reduced to schedules and polite check-ins. Ethan told himself this was normal, that long-term relationships simply changed shape. Still, the emptiness lingered. The drive to the coast was filled with music and half-finished sentences. Lucas joked about work, about how strange it felt to take time off without guilt. Ethan laughed at the right moments, but he noticed how often Lucas glanced his way, as if measuring something unspoken between them. Each look stirred a quiet unease Ethan refused to name. When they arrived, the beach house was smaller than expected, perched just above the shoreline. It wasn't luxurious, but it was private, and that seemed to matter. Lucas carried their bags inside while Ethan stood on the deck, breathing in the salt air. For a brief moment, he felt free. That evening, they walked along the water's edge as the sun dipped low. Their conversation drifted easily, touching on memories and missed chances. Lucas talked about feeling restless, like his life was paused while everyone else moved forward. Ethan understood that feeling too well. He shared less, but Lucas seemed to hear what went unsaid. There were pauses that stretched longer than necessary, moments when neither spoke, yet neither moved away. Ethan told himself it was nostalgia, the comfort of old friendship. Still, his chest tightened when Lucas brushed past him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of his skin. Later, as they sat on the porch with the sound of waves below, Lucas grew quieter. He stared out at the darkening sea, his fingers tapping against the railing. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. "He always did." "You okay?" Ethan asked. Lucas nodded, too quickly. "Yeah. Just thinking." Ethan let it go, though the answer felt incomplete. Over the years, Lucas had shared his fears without filters, his dreams without shame. This silence was new. It made Ethan uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. Inside, as they prepared for the night, Ethan checked his phone. A short message from Mark blinked on the screen. "Hope you're relaxing." Ethan typed a reply, deleted it, then sent something neutral. He told himself the hollow feeling was exhaustion, nothing more. When the lights were off and the house settled into quiet, Ethan lay awake listening to the ocean crash and retreat. He thought about how easily Lucas had slipped into his life again, how natural it felt to be understood without effort. The realization unsettled him. The next morning, they planned to spend the day on the beach. Lucas seemed lighter, joking again, but there was an undercurrent Ethan couldn't shake. As they spread towels on the sand, Lucas hesitated, then looked at him with a seriousness that cut through the brightness of the day. "There's something I need to tell you," Lucas said, his voice low. "I just need the right moment." Ethan nodded, though his pulse quickened. He didn't know what the confession would be, only that it carried weight. As he stared out at the endless water, he sensed that whatever Lucas was holding back would change more than just this trip. The waves rolled in steadily, indifferent to the quiet tension building between them, and Ethan realized that some lines, once approached, could never be unseen, even if they hadn't been crossed yet. By late afternoon, the beach had emptied, leaving behind long stretches of quiet sand and the steady rhythm of the tide. Ethan sat with his knees drawn up, watching Lucas skim stones across the water. Each skip felt deliberate, as if Lucas were buying time with every throw. they hadn't spoken much since that morning. The promise of a confession hovered between them, turning ordinary moments heavy. Ethan told himself not to imagine outcomes, yet his thoughts kept circling the same uneasy questions. Whatever Lucas needed to say, it wasn't small. As the sky softened into muted gold, Lucas finally sat beside him. He didn't look at Ethan right away. Instead, he traced patterns in the sand with his fingers, erasing them almost as soon as they formed. "I didn't bring you here just for a break," Lucas said quietly. Ethan's chest tightened. He nodded, signaling for him to continue. "I've been lying to myself for a long time," Lucas went on. "About what I want. About who matters to me." The words landed slowly, each one sinking deeper than the last. Ethan felt a strange pull between wanting clarity and fearing it. He thought of Mark, of routine dinners, of conversations that no longer surprised him, and then pushed the thought aside, ashamed of how easily it surfaced. Lucas finally turned to face him. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way Ethan had rarely seen. "I care about you more than I should," he said. "More than a friend." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The waves blurred into noise, and Ethan could only hear his own heartbeat. He searched Lucas's face for hesitation, for signs that this was a misunderstanding, but found none. "You don't mean that," Ethan said, though he knew the words were weak. "I do," Lucas replied. "And that's the problem." Lucas explained without rushing, as if he had rehearsed this in silence for weeks. He spoke of late-night calls that lasted too long, of turning to Ethan first when something went wrong, of measuring every other connection against the comfort he felt here. He admitted he hadn't crossed physical boundaries, but acknowledged that something else had shifted, something quieter and harder to define. Ethan listened, stunned by how familiar it all sounded. He recognized himself in Lucas's confession more than he wanted to admit. He had leaned on Lucas when Mark felt distant. He had shared thoughts he should have kept private. He had chosen emotional ease over honest confrontation. "That doesn't make it okay," Ethan said, his voice barely steady. "I know," Lucas answered. "That's why I had to tell you. I couldn't keep pretending it was nothing." Silence settled between them, dense and unavoidable. Ethan stood and walked closer to the water, letting the cold foam lap at his feet. He felt torn between guilt and clarity, between the life he had committed to and the truth now exposed. Lucas hadn't forced anything, yet the confession itself felt like a line drawn in the sand. Ethan thought of Mark again, not as an abstract idea, but as a person who trusted him. The realization stung. He understood, then, that betrayal didn't always arrive with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it crept in quietly, disguised as comfort. When he turned back, Lucas was watching him with restrained hope and visible fear. Ethan wished, briefly, that things were simpler, that feelings obeyed rules. But wishes had never solved anything. "I can't ignore this," Ethan said at last. "But I can't act on it either." Lucas nodded, relief and disappointment crossing his face at once. "I didn't expect you to," he said. "I just needed you to know the truth." The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the beach in shadow. Ethan sat again, this time with a clearer sense of the weight he carried. The confession had changed something fundamental. He could no longer pretend his friendship with Lucas existed outside the boundaries of his relationship. As darkness settled in, Ethan realized that silence was no longer an option. What Lucas had revealed demanded reckoning, not avoidance. He didn't yet know what choice he would make, only that the comfort of not choosing had ended. The waves continued their endless motion, indifferent to human conflict. Ethan watched them, knowing that the hardest part still lay ahead, not in what had been confessed, but in what he would have to face once the beach was left behind. Morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light filtered through the thin curtains, and the sound of the tide felt heavier than it had the night before. Ethan woke with a tightness in his chest, the kind that came from clarity rather than confusion. He knew what had to be done, even if he didn't yet know how to do it. Lucas was already awake, sitting at the small table by the window. He looked up when Ethan entered the room, searching his face for answers. Neither spoke at first. Words, Ethan realized, had lost their casual ease. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, breaking the silence. About us. About everything. Lucas nodded slowly. Me too. Ethan chose his words carefully, aware that honesty now mattered more than comfort. What you told me was real. I won't pretend it wasn't. But I let it happen too. I crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed. Lucas lowered his gaze. I never wanted to put you in this position. I know, Ethan replied. But intention doesn't erase impact. They talked quietly, not to persuade or defend, but to acknowledge. Ethan made it clear that whatever existed between them could not continue in the shadows. Lucas accepted that boundary without argument, though the disappointment was unmistakable. The acceptance hurt more than resistance would have. By late morning, they packed in near silence. The beach that had felt open and freeing now seemed like a place that had witnessed something fragile break. When they stood outside, ready to leave, Lucas spoke again. I don't regret telling you, he said. Even if it costs me. Ethan met his eyes. I don't regret hearing it. But I won't build something new on dishonesty. They parted without promises, without dramatic closure. Just a quiet understanding that some connections, once altered, could never return to their original shape. The drive home felt longer than the trip out. Ethan rehearsed the conversation he knew awaited him, though no version softened the truth. When he reached his apartment, Mark was already there, folding laundry with methodical care. The ordinary scene made Ethan's chest ache. We need to talk, Ethan said. Mark looked up immediately, sensing the shift. They sat across from each other, the space between them suddenly vast. Ethan spoke plainly, resisting the urge to minimize. He admitted that he had grown emotionally distant, that he had leaned on someone else in ways he should not have. He did not excuse himself, nor did he dramatize what had happened. Mark listened without interruption. When Ethan finished, the silence that followed was heavy but controlled. So you didn't cheat, Mark said slowly. But you left me without telling me you were gone. The accuracy of the statement stunned Ethan. He nodded, unable to argue. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. There was pain in his eyes, but also clarity. I wish you'd talk to me first, he said. But I can't pretend this doesn't change how I see us. They spoke for a long time, not to repair what was broken, but to understand it. By the end of the conversation, the decision was mutual, though no less painful. Ending things felt like acknowledging a truth that had been quietly waiting. That night, alone in the apartment, Ethan sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on. He thought of Lucas, of Mark, of himself. He understood now that love demanded presence, not just intention. Avoidance had been his greatest failure. The beach confession had left him speechless, but its aftermath gave him something else: responsibility. He didn't know what the future held, or who might be part of it. He only knew that silence had cost him too much already. As the room settled into quiet, Ethan accepted that growth rarely arrived gently. Sometimes it came disguised as loss, forcing truth into the open. And though the story was far from over, he finally felt prepared to live the next chapter without hiding from it. Weeks passed, marked not by dramatic change but by the quiet discipline of adjustment. Ethan learned how loud absence could be. The apartment no longer carried Mark's routines, and the stillness forced Ethan to confront thoughts he once drowned in distraction. Each day felt deliberate, as if he were relearning how to occupy his own life. He avoided Lucas at first. Not out of resentment, but out of caution. Distance, Ethan told himself, was necessary for honesty to settle into something solid. He focused on work, on long walks, on rebuilding a rhythm that didn't depend on emotional shortcuts. The effort was exhausting, but it felt earned. One evening, a message appeared on his phone: Lucas, I hope you're okay. No pressure to reply. Ethan stared at the screen longer than he needed to. The restraint in Lucas's words mattered. It showed respect for the boundaries they had drawn together. After a moment, Ethan typed back: Ethan, I'm doing better. Slowly, the conversation didn't continue, and that was enough. The exchange felt like closure without erasure. an acknowledgement that something meaningful had existed without demanding it return. Later that night, Ethan met Mark to exchange the last of their shared belongings. The interaction was gentle, almost careful. They spoke like people who had learned from each other, even if the lesson had come late. "I don't hate you," Mark said, handing him a small box. "I just need to move forward." "I know," Ethan replied. "I want that for you." As Mark walked away, Ethan felt the finality settle, not as regret, but as acceptance. The relationship had ended not because of a single confession, but because of a series of silences neither had known how to break. On his way home, Ethan detoured toward the coast, drawn back to the place where everything had surfaced. The beach looked unchanged, indifferent to personal history. He walked along the shoreline, replaying that moment when Lucas had spoken the truth aloud. He understood now that the confession had not been an invitation, but a mirror. Ethan realized how easily he had mistaken emotional refuge for resolution. Lucas had been a reflection of unmet needs, not a solution to them. That distinction mattered. It allowed Ethan to appreciate the connection without surrendering to it. As dusk settled, Ethan felt something unfamiliar but welcome: calm. Not certainty, not closure, just calm. He knew there would be future conversations, perhaps even another meeting with Lucas when time had softened the edges. But for now, he was content to let understanding replace urgency. He turned back toward the road, aware that growth rarely announced itself. It showed up quietly, in better choices and clearer boundaries. The beach had given him truth, the distance since had given him perspective. Ethan didn't know who he would love next, or when. What he did know was this: honesty, even when it shattered comfort, had freed him from living half-present. And that freedom, fragile as it felt, was something he intended to protect. As the waves continued their endless return to shore, Ethan walked on, no longer speechless, just listening, finally ready to hear himself clearly.